is Ian Manse. I'm a staff attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and was one of the part of the team that developed this website, along with Colin, Copeland, Andy Shapiro, and Dylan Young, who are up here front. The site that we're releasing today has been under development for the better part of 2 years. It started in 2013, was inspired in part by the work of Frank Baumgartner at UNC. He's a political scientist, and started to look into Frank's work and understood that all this data that he was publishing he was getting directly from the Department of Justice. And so, working with Frank, we requested the data at SCSJ and initially built a version of this database, actually more or less what you're going to see today, but just kind of in-house. And the idea was we wanted to have this database so that we could field requests from all sorts of people around the state who we knew wanted to make use of this data, but that existed in a way that was really inaccessible. North Carolina was actually the first state in the country to pass a data collection law for traffic stops back in 1999, but really more than a decade passed before anyone to our knowledge ever requested or sought to analyze this data. And so we invested in getting it set up on our computers and started fielding these requests on a fairly regular basis. And we used this database to do things like provide data research and support to groups like the Fayetteville Coalition here in Durham, which at the time was lobbying the city council to take a look at traffic stop and search protocols with Durham PD, which ultimately led to some changes to those protocols, most notably the written consent policy that went into effect in October 2014. After that effort, we started to field a lot more requests from community groups around the state who were interested in having access to the sort of metrics that inform the policy discussion here in Durham. And the process became really time-consuming. We were really getting more requests than we could handle. And that was ultimately what kind of led to the idea of seeing if there might be a way to automate this and put this information online and kind of remove ourselves as the middlemen from the process. And that's where Colin Copeland came in. Colin is the CTO here at Caktus, which is hosting this event today. This is their office. And I knew that Colin had a history of kind of working on social justice causes. If you look out in the hallway here, there's some information about all the different interesting projects that Caktus Consulting has been involved in over the years, from working on the Libyan elections to tracking aid for Syrian refugees to helping public schools enroll students. And so I thought he might be the right guy to approach. I didn't have any money for this project. I just kind of had this idea. And I knew that Colin was plugged in with the local Code for Durham brigade, which is an affiliate of Code for America, which is an organization kind of devoted to overcoming technological hurdles and getting people more civically engaged with technology and data. And so I approached him and told him that I didn't have any money to pay him, but I wondered if he might be interested in helping make this idea a reality, and he very graciously said that he would. And then very shortly afterwards, Andy Shapiro and Dylan Young, who was actually a college roommate of mine, who they are data scientist and software developer, respectively, software engineer. I told them about the project. We really needed kind of all three of their skill sets to make this happen, and so they also very graciously volunteered their time on this project and have been working on it regularly, really off and on for the last year and a half. Back in April, we got a call from the White House, which was very unexpected, but they had heard that we had this site under works, and they said that the President's task force, there was a task force created after the Ferguson situation last summer. The President's task force on 21st century policing is what it was called, and it was a group of police chiefs that kind of got together and made a series of recommendations designed to improve the quality of policing in the United States. And they issued a report in May 2015, you can find it online, and they identified a series of 6 or 7 pillars that they recommended, that kind of principles that police departments commit themselves to. And one of those principles was open data. Specifically, they recommended that data on traffic stops, specifically demographic data, start being collected where it is not being collected. And I should say that in most places in the United States, this data is not being collected. North Carolina is one of only a handful of states that has this data available. But they recommended that states start collecting this data broken down by race and ethnicity, and reporting it and putting it online. And so they had heard that our project essentially was designed to do just that. So we went up to the White House in April and demoed this site to Dr. DJ Patel, who's the chief U.S. data scientist, and to a group of about 15 big city police chiefs who were there to basically talk about open data, what it meant for them and their departments. We will put a quote up from Dr. Patel in just a moment. Actually, yeah, we got it right here. So this is, Dr. Patel is data scientist who's kind of leading the White House's police data initiative efforts. And so anyway, this meeting was part of something called the White House Police Data Initiative, of which more and more agencies in recent months have kind of committed themselves. The idea is to make public data that previously has not been public about police agencies. And Chief Medlock and Fayetteville PD have been participating in that initiative for quite a while, and it was through these contacts that we came to know Chief Medlock, and we've been kind of paying attention to what had been happening in Fayetteville, all the positive things that have been happening to Fayetteville in the last couple of years. And so that was kind of the basis of the origin of this partnership that we're here to discuss today. So before we show the site, I just want to point out that the site that you're about to see is not necessarily the final version of this site. This is a work in progress. And in a few months, we're going to be adding some additional features to the ones that you see today. And the first of which will be a feature on the Fayetteville Police Department page that's going to visualize the location of traffic stops. There's a story, lead story in the NNO this morning about this website, and there's a quote from the Police Chiefs Association saying that they embraced the idea of open data, but they had some concerns about the lack of locational data and how they felt like if that data was available, it would more properly contextualize these traffic stop numbers. And we anticipated that was going to be the reaction. In fact, that was one of the first things Chief Medlock and I talked about when we sat down. And he said that he's been collecting this data, requiring his officers to collect this locational data for a while now, and that he was willing to make it available to us. So his data folks provided it to us, we've given it to our developers, and they're in the process of building that feature. So in a few months when you log on to the Fayetteville page, you'll see a map of Fayetteville, and it'll basically be color-coded to kind of clearly indicate where traffic stops are happening most intently. And this is a feature that we are hoping to provide for a lot of departments around the state. Right now, the data collection statute from which we draw this information does not require locational data be collected. It seems, though, that it's something that police chiefs, community folks, lawyers, I mean, really all stakeholders in this discussion are interested in having. And so we're really going to work in the future to facilitate that, to add further context to the site. But we need to form these partnerships with these police agencies. It's my understanding that Charlotte collects this data, that Greensboro has started to, and I believe that Durham has started to collect this data. So hopefully we'll have this feature available to them shortly. So all that said, I want to do a quick run through of the site, but before I do, I wanted to have Colin tell you a little bit about how the site was put together and what it might mean for, what the way it was put together means for other people who might want to take this idea and try to build on it in other states and jurisdictions.
Thanks, Ian. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, I will provide a brief background of how the site was built and a little bit about the data, and then Ian and I will show you some live demos.
Colin, just so we have it, could you say your name and spell it, just so we have that on tape?
Colin, Copeland, C-O-L-I-N, C-O-P-E. Thank you. So yeah, first the data set. It's a state-level data set. There's legislation passed to essentially collect this in North Carolina in 2000. So we have about almost 15 years of data. This includes all state and county agencies as well as local police departments that meet a minimum population thresholds. So we have all data for all 100 counties, including 311 police agencies. This includes State Highway Patrol, to County Sheriff Departments, to UNC Chapel Hill Police Department. Over 18 million stops are in the data set, and about roughly half, 46% of these, are for the State Highway Patrol, so they're a big piece of the data set. And the 10 largest agencies, which include the biggest cities, Greensboro, Raleigh, Charlotte, make up for about 70% of all the data. And so, to give you just a high-level snapshot of what we have, everything is centered around the stops. And so we have when a stop happened, the agency of the stop, and then an officer ID. It's all anonymized. It's just IDs of officers, and then some metadata about the stop, including why the stop happened, who the people were, or some demographic information about the people in the car. If a search happened, was contraband found, was use of force used. And so we took this data and built a website around it to better show and display it for everybody. So it aggregates and displays all the traffic stop data. And there are 3 primary features. The first that you see here is what we call the agency dashboard, which is a series of graphs that shows you over time how stops and searches look different between races and ethnicities. There's an officer dashboard, which looks pretty much exactly like this, but it's honed down a little bit more to a particular officer ID. And then we have a find a stop feature, which will allow you to search using basic criteria to narrow down and find a particular stop, which we'll show you. So briefly, just about how it was built. It was entirely a volunteer effort. Andy, Dill, and I built it as volunteers. And so I think we just saw ourselves as excited technologists who believed in what Ian was working on and wanted to do something for the public good. And in the end, I think this was kind of an invaluable partnership between civic technologists and nonprofits and the local government to put this all together. The project is entirely open source, which basically just means that the code that powers it is available to anyone to use. They can use it for themselves, or they can contribute to the code base and help us improve it. And we've already started looking for help, as Ian mentioned. We meet. There's a Code for Durham, which is a group of civic-minded technologists that work on local apps for local issues. And there's a brigade here that we actually meet here. And we've already started looking at some of the Fayetteville data that was passed along. So it's already off to a good start, and we can engage more volunteer effort going forward. And so that is a brief overview, and so I will hand it over to Ian here to step through.
So we're just going to demo a few of the site's features. So we're going to start by looking at, we thought we looked at Greensboro Police Department, because Greensboro, as many of you probably saw, was the subject of a recent front page New York Times article last month about this very issue, traffic stop data. So we just figured we'd use them. So the first thing you see is census data. This is just raw census data from the last census. It is here simply to orient the user who may not be familiar with a given jurisdiction about the general racial characteristic of a given city. Some of the feedback we've already gotten is that, and I think I've already seen it in some of the early press on this, is that this doesn't necessarily reflect the driving population in a given jurisdiction. That is true, and we don't deny that, and we are open to and would like to find solutions to kind of better represent the driving population. It's just that data is very hard to come by. But so the rough idea, though, is just to kind of orient the user to this general jurisdiction. The next thing you'll see is the annual percentage of stops by race and ethnicity. And Colin, if you drag over the line, you'll see that if you drag over, it will give you the actual percentage numbers here. And if you click this data tab, and this data tab exists on all the features on our site, this will give you the raw numbers of stops broken down by race and ethnicity. So this exists for all stops. You can also, this is a pie graph, or I guess you would call it, that represents the racial breakdown of stops since data started being collected 15 years ago. But as you'll see, there's a drop-down menu, so you can select, if you're interested in what was happening in a given year, you can select that year, and the chart will automatically adjust itself to reflect who was stopped. And if you actually hover over it, it'll give you the actual raw numbers of stops as well. You scroll down to the next feature, Colin, you'll see the departmental search rate. So what we've got here is the black line represents all drivers combined. So this just gives you, on an annual basis, the percentage of traffic stops that resulted in someone being searched by the officer. And so you see it fluctuates over time. The blue line represents black drivers, the green line represents white drivers. We also have tabs for Native American, Asian, and other. Those are the categories that the state collects, and so you can toggle them on and off, and it'll appear, and you can have kind of get the search rate very easily for all races. You scroll down next, you see these same numbers are broken down by race and ethnicity. So this is the percentage on an annual basis of people out of the searched population broken down by race and ethnicity. So what we're looking at now is race. So again, scroll down to here, maybe Colin. So 2015, it looks like African Americans were 73% of searches in Greensboro. Whites were 25%. And actually, I want to just real quick, Colin, if you can scroll to the top, all of these features that you're seeing also exist for ethnicity. So if you toggle here, you get a Hispanic, non-Hispanic comparison. Now, some states conflate race and ethnicity. Maryland, for example, on their forms that the officers fill out, it's either white, black, or Latino. Here, it's white, black, Hispanic, non-Hispanic binary. So that's what we have to work with. Obviously, there are white Hispanics, black Hispanics, and so that's just kind of the way we had to build this as a result of the way the statute is written. But if we switch back to race and scroll down, I'm going to get to this next feature, which is the likelihood of search by stop cause. So this feature, it's a little confusing, but basically, excuse me, allows you to make comparisons between racial and ethnic groups about the relative likelihood of a search occurring based on the historical data for any given reason. So, for example, in Greensboro, seatbelt violations. It's a common reason people are stopped. When you look at all the white drivers who have been stopped in Greensboro for not wearing their seatbelt, and you compare the outcomes of those stops to all the black drivers who have been stopped in Greensboro for not wearing their seatbelt, you see that there's a big disparity, a 215% greater likelihood that that stop is going to result in a search if that driver is African American. And typically what you see, if you spend some time on the site, is that as you go down this kind of list, these numbers will get bigger. So these tend to be the more discretionary violations, whereas DWI, you see there's no disparity. There's actually a negative disparity. DWI being, of course, the traffic offense where there's the most objective evidence of driver kind of wrongdoing. So if you toggle between races, so you can do Native American to white, Asian to white, so you can kind of get these metrics, see the relative likelihoods in between racial and ethnic groups. And the same feature is available if you scroll to the top and do ethnicity, same thing. You scroll down here, you see the contraband hit rate. So this gives you an idea of how effective are these police agencies being in finding contraband in these searches. And so this is 15 years worth of data in Greensboro here. What you see is that historically 30% of the white drivers who were searched were found with contraband, 29% of the black drivers who were searched. So really no difference. Actually, whites had a slightly greater likelihood in Greensboro, but as you saw when we were up top, there were African American drivers were much more likely to be searched. And then finally at the bottom here, we've got the use of force data broken down by race and ethnicity. You can kind of stack them, and these are color-coded again using the same colors as above. And this just reports the number of traffic stops that led to force being used. Now this is just, we don't have a lot of details about the force was used, and obviously a lot of use of force incidents that you hear about occur outside of the context of traffic stops. So I want to be clear that this only reports use of force incidents that happen in the course of vehicle traffic stops. And for all these features, again, you've got these pie charts that you can adjust if you're interested in looking at the year-by-year data. And you've also got the raw numbers behind it. So that's the general gist of just the dashboard, the agency dashboard. We can toggle over to the highway patrol page. Actually, I want to scroll down and just make another note about the contraband hit rate. Because I think the contraband hit rate was something significant to policymakers here in Durham when they were kind of wrestling with these issues last year. State Highway Patrol is, like Colin said, the biggest data set in this database. Highway Patrol officers make a lot of stops every day. Their search rate is actually quite low compared. The average police officer in North Carolina search rate is about 3.2%. For Highway Patrol, we do a lot more stops. It's lower than that. But nevertheless, Highway Patrol over 15 years has done nearly 60,000 vehicle searches. And what you see is that there's no difference between white and black drivers in terms of what they've uncovered. So this is the biggest search data set we have, and what you see is statewide, no racial difference in terms of the contraband hit rate, which would suggest that it would not be appropriate to search black drivers at an elevated rate relative to white drivers, because it seems like everyone's basically driving around with contraband at more or less the same rate. So let's go to the next tab. So this is the Fayetteville PD page. We have Chief Medlock here today, so as you can see, this is the stops by race. If you scroll down here to this feature, you will notice a very, and Chief Medlock can kind of talk about the policies behind their numbers, but you can see that Fayetteville has been trending in a downward direction for some time in terms of their search numbers. If you could read press accounts from the administration preceding Chief Medlock's, you will see there was a lot in the paper 2010, 2011 about concerns about kind of the frequency with which vehicle searches and vehicle stops were happening in Fayetteville, and some policies were implemented in response to that, and they seem to be paying off. I think they were designed to reduce these racial inequities, improve community relations, and the numbers bear that out. They show a downward trend here. So if we scroll down to the contraband rate, you will see that Fayetteville's contraband seizure rates are actually significantly higher than most departments you're going to see. And that is because they're being more economical and deliberative about the search decisions that they're making. If you were to go back and look at the Fayetteville data from a decade ago, these numbers would be about half of what they were. And so they're still finding contraband, they're still taking guns out of cars, but they're doing it in a way that is inconveniencing less innocent drivers. And that is reflected in the contraband hit rate. And if you scroll down as well, another benefit of sort of this philosophy that Chief Medlock has brought to traffic stops is use of force. If you look 5 years ago, Fayetteville was averaging, more than one use of force incident in a traffic stop per month. Last year and the year before, they only had one. And so that's another positive benefit of some of those policies. Next thing I want to talk about is the individual officer feature. I've gotten a number of kind of inquiries about how this works. So what you see here, or what you saw on those preceding pages, the dashboard, also exists for every individual officer in the state, because every individual officer reports by a unique anonymous ID code. So let's pull up this Orange County officer. So this is an officer that I specifically chose because I'm aware of the fact that this officer's stop data became an issue in a court case just last year in Orange County. It basically came to light after concerns, after the reason that he initiated a stop of a Hispanic motorist came to be an issue. So this is, I want to point out that we have the Hispanic, the ethnicity tab clicked here. So this is, the green is Hispanic drivers, the blue is non-Hispanic drivers. So this is Orange County, which is the Chapel Hill area, obviously single-digit Hispanic population. And you see here, there were years, there was in 2009, this officer, 61% of all his traffic stops were of Hispanic drivers in an area that there really are very few Hispanics. And so what ultimately happened in this case, which was a fairly significant case, was the charges, well, one of the individuals arrested by this officer got a very favorable plea deal because of concerns on the part of I think the district attorney, that this data raised a lot of very serious questions about this officer's reason for making the stop that led to this particular arrest. There had been some other arrests that had also been made by this officer that were in federal court that ultimately were just dismissed outright because of concerns about what this data showed. Now, they didn't use this website to find the data. I'm pulling up this page just to kind of illustrate it. It kind of came to light through, it's kind of a long story, how the attorney on this case came to recognize that the data might show what it in fact shows. If you scroll down, you'll see the search rate was just off the chart for Hispanics for a number of years. If you scroll down to percent of search by race and ethnicity, what you see is that there were 4 consecutive years where this officer searched as many Hispanics or more Hispanics than non-Hispanics, again in a county with very few Hispanics. And you can see obviously huge disparities in the likelihood of search for Hispanics. And then if you look at his hit rate for Hispanics was 1%. So he was incredibly ineffective. He was stopping 100 innocent drivers and searching them in between stops where he actually found something in the car. And so this, you can imagine that if you are Chief Medlock, for example, and this officer is on your force, you'd prefer to know about this information prior to it getting to the point where cases are getting tossed in court. And so part of what this site is designed to do is to empower people like Chief Medlock who are in a position to know these ID numbers, to get a very easy idea of what their officers' enforcement patterns look like. And so and I'm going to have him kind of give further comment on that in a minute. I just want to show one more feature. So this is a feature designed for the general public. So if you are well, I'll try to remember. So let's assume that you are a 20-year-old black male in Durham. And you were stopped on let's say September 11th, 2014. I'm just using a particular example I'm aware of. You enter in, so basically what you're going to do, you're a 20-year-old black male, and you're driving home at 6 o'clock in the evening, and you have an encounter with a police officer, and it just doesn't feel right. You have a suspicion that perhaps the stop was illegitimate, that the officer maybe singled you out because of your race. You can log on to this website and plug in your demographic information and the date of your stop and any other information, and you scroll down to the bottom and you hit submit. Okay, obviously I picked you got 2011 instead of 14. So this is going to give you a list of all the, so there were 5 20-year-old black males stopped in Durham that day, but you know you were stopped at 8 a.m. So you click this hyperlink, 6:57, and it pulls up this page. So this is the officer that stopped you, so you know who this officer is. You scroll down and say, well, what else has this Durham officer been doing? Well, you see that 91% of all traffic stops made by this officer were of black drivers. You scroll down and you see that of those drivers, and this is an officer, this is a very high volume stop officer, I don't remember how many stops he has, but it's significant. You see that in 2011 he was searching 82%. 82% of all the black drivers that he stopped. And again, the average police officer in North Carolina searches 3%. So you might say if you were arrested in this stop, if a search was done and something was found, you might mention this to your attorney, hey, you might want to look into this. And you see that the same exists for search. So that's kind of the idea behind this find a stop feature. And so if you're Chief Medlock, however, you don't need to, it's simpler. If you're a police chief, you know the numbers of all these officers. So you just type in, so let's say Chief Medlock was Orange County, we go back to that example we had just a moment ago, I think it was 2089. So he knows that number. He types that. Simple as that. He's got career enforcement history for that particular officer. And so one of the things that we really want, I mean, we see multiple applications for this site, and you're going to hear a little bit about this, but one of the things we really hope will happen now that this data is online is that police chiefs will embrace this and will integrate this into their, you know, one of the things that we hope will happen with this site is that police management will embrace it and will integrate this into their sort of yearly evaluations or quarterly evaluations of officer performance, so that you're not relying simply on complaints you know, that might have been called into the department, so you can get objective empirical data about you know, their stop and search behavior on the streets. One of the things we learned, and again, going back to what kind of gave us the idea for this site to begin with, was just the conversations that I was having with police chiefs around the state, who kept telling me, yes, we collect all this data, we've been collecting this data for years, but we've never really looked at it because we're not set up in-house to kind of visualize it, to make those sort of interagency comparisons that might be helpful. Most police chiefs, if you called them and you said, how does your search rate compare to that of, you know, this other city that is similar in size or similar in demographics, probably wouldn't be able to answer you. This site now will make those interagency comparisons very easy for people to do. And obviously there's a lot of applications for this site, but that's one of the more significant ones. We think that it is a means by which police agencies can improve sort of their oversight capabilities. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Chief Medlock from Fayetteville and have him make some comments.
Thanks, Ian. And first, forgive the voice. Fighting what probably most of you are fighting at this time of year. So it's good to be with you today. I'll tell you a quick story about 2 months into my tenure at Fayetteville. I walked in my office one day, and on my desk was 3 stacks of paper, about 18 inches high for all 3 of them. So I called one of my assistant chiefs in and said, what is this? And they said, well, this is the traffic stop data that we give to you and you're supposed to go through every month. And I said, get that out of here. There's no way that I can take what you have given me and make any sense out of it at all. So we started trying to find ways to understand the data better. The problem for the last 15 years, North Carolina has done a phenomenal job of collecting data, but we don't have, as police executives, as police departments, we don't have a reasonable way to make any sense of that. It's basically raw data. Useful data to someone, but certainly not 3 18-inch stacks of paper for a month's worth of work. So through our work with the President's 21st Century Policing Initiative, we learned about the White House Open Data Source Initiative and invited ourselves to the party. And so the White House included Fayetteville PD as part of that initiative, in trying to help us learn and the rest of the country in policing learn a little bit more about how we understand data, especially as it relates to traffic stops. But it's all data, arrest data, demographic data, all of that. And even where I hope we'll go with this project is even into field contacts, which is an often overlooked part of what we do, and that is interviewing someone who happens to be in an area that the officer gets out and speaks with as an investigative tool. So Ian and the Southern Coalition were introduced to us. They came down and visited with us and showed us this technology, and it makes sense. It makes sense for a couple of reasons. For a mid-sized department out of a policing profession of 16,000 agencies across the country, it made sense in that now I have a management tool, a supervisory management tool, because I've got news for you. This is not all on the chief's shoulders. This is on our frontline supervisors at the sergeant and lieutenant level. It should also be on the officers' level, so that they can understand more about what they're doing out there from a data approach. And certainly the chief has that oversight. But the other reason that we were so interested in working with Southern Coalition is it's free. And so, Ian, I love you, brother. But, you know, there's a couple of things about that. First, the cost was important to us, but the other thing is, we're working with a group of folks that we're not paying. Who's going to trust, and a lot of times, the results of someone that a department or city may be paying? And so we thought it was important to be open and to be transparent with our community, that we would have an organization such as the Southern Coalition for Justice to work with us. And frankly, that's raised some eyebrows among some of my peers across the state. Why would you open yourselves up to Southern Coalition for Justice? I'm really not opening Fayetteville Police Department up to the Southern Coalition for Justice. I'm opening the Fayetteville Police Department up to our customers, the people that we serve. And the Southern Coalition for Justice is simply providing a vehicle that makes it easy to understand. It helps us start to understand trends, to identify those trends and those concerns or those problem officers. It helps us understand the need for additional training, the additional education for our officers, and to understand in some context even crime. And so that's why we're here today, because we believe in the product that you're being shown. I also believe this is very early in the process. We're all going to learn from it, and it's going to improve. And I think that what we learned from this, being part of this early pioneer process and program with these folks, is going to help policing in North Carolina, certainly. But it's also going to continue to have North Carolina at the forefront of policing across the country. As I've been involved in this process for the last few months and learned that other states don't collect data at all, or the data that is collected is just not trustworthy, I'm proud of our state for doing what we've done, and when we did it as early as we did, we just now have 20 million or so stops that we need to understand a little bit better about how we're doing business. And I'm sure we'll be here for questions as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Medlock. We're now going to invite Charlie Reese, who is a newly elected member of the Durham City Council, to offer some comments. Charlie was, prior to being elected on the council, was very active in the local campaign in 2013 and 2014 to bring about some changes to Durham PD's stop and search protocols. And a big part of that process was the data, so I'm going to have Charlie kind of offer some comments on that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlie Reese, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the importance of the officer stop data that this project will make available to communities across North Carolina. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did in Durham last year to end some of the racial disparities in traffic stop data that we saw as a result of some of the work that Ian and the Southern Coalition did to show us that data. And I'm also going to talk about a little bit about how we can use this data going forward as we try to make sure that the city of Durham has the kind of policing that aligns with our community's values. Before I get into that, though, let me just say how much I love a project like this that springs out of the passion of a young lawyer who lives here in Durham, who goes to a business right here in Durham, and that they offer their services to try to create something special that serves both the people of Durham but also the state of North Carolina. As a member of the City Council and as a business owner myself, that means a lot to me. So thank you so much for taking that step to do this important work. As Ian mentioned, I am a newly elected member of the City Council. I was sworn in 10 days ago. Haven't solved all the problems yet, but I'm working on it. I still have a few days left in my 4-year term, so I'm not done yet. But in the summer of 2014, about 18 months ago, I was part of an effort here in Durham that brought together community leaders and community organizations from across a broad spectrum of issues of concern to combat troubling racial disparities in the traffic and drug enforcement practices of the Durham Police Department. Now, our police officers do a dangerous and difficult job every day, and we owe them our thanks. But the racial disparities that were uncovered by the FADE Coalition, the group that Ian talked about that really spearheaded this work. The disparities that were uncovered by the FADE Coalition were simply too troubling to ignore. And that's why we came together as a community, as a city, to advocate for policy reforms that were designed to address those disparities. And when we talked to folks last summer about this issue and the critical need for those policy reforms, whether it was talking to the mayor or members of the city council or the city manager or even members of the press, our most persuasive arguments during that time were arguments grounded in the officer stop data. It's one thing to do as the FADE Coalition did, to bring powerful personal stories of people who have been impacted by these disparities, by these types of traffic stops. It's another thing to show policymakers the hard data that backs up the reality that these disparities exist and that they diminish us as a community. And Ian talked a little bit about some of the disparities that are in other places. Let me just talk to you a little bit about the specifics that we were facing in Durham at that time. It's one thing to look at the fact that Durham's traffic search rate overall was about 2.5 times the state average. That's pretty remarkable. But when you look at who was being searched, it's even worse. African Americans as a whole make up about 40% of the city's population. But 80% of those who were subject to traffic searches in Durham were African American. That's not acceptable. Once you're pulled over, once a driver is pulled over, African American drivers were asked by police officers to consent to a search of their vehicle at 2.5 times the rate that white drivers were asked to consent to a search of their vehicle. That's unacceptable. And in the end, the ability to access and analyze this hard data, this concrete officer stop data, to show policymakers the reality of what's happening in that one narrow aspect of policing was key to making the argument and convincing city leaders of the need for these concrete policy reforms. And the reforms that we championed last year were put into effect not just because of those personal stories I talked about, but because we have the hard data to back it up. We can show it to policymakers, and it made a huge difference. Now that I'm a member of the Durham City Council, the availability of officer stop data will be essential to us as we go forward. Number one, to make sure that the effectiveness of the programs we put into place and the reforms that we enacted last year are making a difference in reducing those racial disparities and reducing the high number of traffic searches that were taking place in Durham. But also to make sure that it's part of an ongoing effort to ensure that Durham's police department treats all of our citizens with respect and equality under the law. So thanks to OpenDataPolicingNC.com, which, by the way, and I'll work with you on a better name. I'm pretty good at that kind of stuff. Members of the Durham City Council will be able to see for ourselves whether or not these racial disparities are decreasing, and if they're not, what else we can do to try to end them once and for all. So I just want to say thanks again to Ian Manse and the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Special thanks to Caktus Group for really putting in the sweat equity to make this thing work. And the volunteers, thank you so much for doing that. The Code Durham and Code for America. I'm really excited to see what communities across North Carolina are able to do with the data and analytics that are being unleashed today. So that's what I want to say. Thank you so much, Ian. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think we'll take a few questions now, and then maybe for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll go out to the hallway and people want to kind of get some one-on-one time with anyone on the panel here, or Dylan, or one of our developers.